Good morning, good afternoon, good day, good life, good evening, wherever you are, whatever you're doing. Sit with me in this light for a moment and just drink it in, bask in it. And I ask that you open in receptivity to receive that which is pouring through from all of the open upper channels. So if you would, go ahead and sit either cross-legged or sit with at least one leg closed with the ankle sitting in front of the perineum, and you can put the other leg on top or in front or simply have it hanging down. I have my right foot on the floor planted flat, and so when you sit in a cross-legged posture, you're closing off the lower three, what are called in the yogic sciences the lower three chakras, the lower three centers, which relate to survival and movement, therefore, in the three-dimensional world in terms of your physical, mental, and emotional survival, which all end up relating back to physical survival anyhow. And the upper four centers, the principal centers, are open and ready to receive. And so it doesn't matter what tradition or what background or what cultural mode you come from. I come from many, and I have access to many different systems, many different traditional and cultural modes, and many different linguistic modes of expression of these mysteries and the awareness of the system physically, mentally, emotionally, and energetically. So forgive me if you feel that there's some pull into one mode or another. There isn't. I'm open to you as you are, and I ask that you be open to me as I am, and I will very likely be freely switching between different linguistic or cultural or traditional modes of exposition as is most convenient for the sake of transmitting what needs to be transmitted. If you're here, you clearly have known yourself, at least you've caught a glimpse, or you are very much aware and situated in the truth, in the fact that you are a being of light. When I say a being of light, what I mean is that your very structure is literally made of light. If you haven't been made aware of this fact through direct revelation, then if you would simply be receptive to me, to that which I am, to the consciousness that I am, which is the consciousness that you are, the consciousness that is, there is an opportunity now to realize directly for yourself the nature of omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent light that is the very foundation of all manifest creation, and in fact which is the very essence of all manifest creation. Everything that is positively manifest, by which I mean everything that is, everything that exists, everything that can be seen, heard, tasted, smelled, touched, held, grasped, and even thought of. That is, even the physical structure of thought, which is itself a physical structure, which is obedient, therefore, to the 5 fundamental forces of physics: gravity, strong and weak nuclear forces, electromagnetism, and that so-called mysterious 5th force, which physicists have yet to agree upon a proper name for. Just like all physical manifestation. And everything that is physical is, as you know, vibration, which could also be called energy, but that very vibration is light. You could also call it sound. And so sound is light, and light is sound. The eyes take the vibration and turn it into light. The ears take, or the visual apparatus, right? But light is relative to the eyes insofar as photonic light is concerned. The ears take vibration, turn it into sound. The nose takes vibration, turns it into scent, the tongue into taste, and the tactile sensory perception into touch with all of its textures and temperatures. And so everything that is, you could say, is solidified light. Anything that you perceive to be of a nature of density that can be touched, grasped, and perceived is, you can say, either condensed light or condensed sound. It means the same thing. Light is sound, sound is light. And sound and light, therefore, are and will be the future of technology, medicine. And sound and light are what you conduct when you speak. The voice is a conductor of sound and light, vibration. And so everything you speak is charged with a certain electromagnetism. It has an electromagnetic frequency. So what is it charged with? If the heart center, the heart chakra, or in the Nordic shamanic tradition, Vie, the sacred space, the heart center, is not open, is not active, then the contents of the voice can only come from a disconnected lower drive or a disconnected lower center. From a disconnected, you would call it in the Chinese system, the lower dantian, which is not connected to the middle and the upper dantians or cauldrons or centers of awareness, of energetic transfusion or transception. The will center in the Nordic tradition, Vidli or Vitli. In the yogic system, the lower 3 chakras, the Muladhara, the Svadhisthana, and the Manipuraka. These are centers of, we call them the lower centers, or the centers of the lower self, not because they're inferior in terms of evaluation system, which you would commonly understand the word inferior to mean in contrast with its counterpart superior, but the literal meaning of those words. In Latin, inferior simply means lower, or that which is below, and superior simply means higher, or that which is above. And so you have the lower lip and the upper lip, right? And so this is called the labia inferior and the labia superior, right? Just upper and lower. It's not an evaluation system. It's simply relative placement one to the other. So the lower self is absolutely necessary and impossible to not be in terms of physical survival and the manifestation of the physical body. As long as there's a physical body, the lower centers must exist, because the lower centers are the survival structure, the part of the survival mechanism of the body. And if the body were not surviving, we wouldn't be here to be having this conversation. So they must be there, but they must be properly active and they must be in their right place. And mixing the higher and the lower doesn't do us any good. Each must be allowed to engage in its proper mode of activity. I think that's very obvious. When the heart center is closed, the sacred space, the temple, when this is closed, the voice can only be a reflection of the scurried and scattered energies of survival, which can then only come from what we call conditioning, psychological conditioning, socio-cultural conditioning, and therefore the voice will only be able to speak ignorance, which is sometimes also called darkness. And this word darkness, we must differentiate artificial darkness, which one would call the ignorance of knowledge, the ignorance that is the consequence of knowledge, knowledge as in that which is psychologically absorbed through time, knowledge about this or that or the other in the so-called external world, the very knowledge that there is an external versus an internal world, that knowledge, which is division, which is the source of division, and that very division is ignorance. And so the knowledge, which is the source of division, the source of labeling, categorizing, boxing, automatically brings with it ignorance. And this is a bipolar or a dualistic state of perception, which is the result of psychological conditioning, or is the same thing as the conditioning, which is the nature of the survival process in the human being, insofar as thought is used as the most basic tool of the achievement of survival. However, as you see clearly, to live only from that place is to live, insofar as human relationship is concerned, violently, hatefully, aggressively, always thinking in terms of my survival versus somebody else's survival, which can only bring about warfare, division, and all the problems of competition and destruction, which we end up seeing, leads to self-destruction. Because as long as one is caught in survival mode, there's only an endless circling around and never in fact seeing where one is heading, because the immediate need, and by immediate, the brain divides time into segments, into fragments, and focuses on this fragment of time versus that fragment of time, certainly excluding those fragments of time which seem to be too far out and therefore irrelevant in terms of the immediate temporal need of survival. And so in this mode of ignorance meaning not looking, there's a wonderful Sanskrit word which is used in the Buddhist and the yogic contexts called avidya, which is translated as ignorance often. Avidya literally means not seeing. And so in the mode of pure survival, there is automatically an ignorance. There's a not seeing, because there has to be. In order for there to be some kind of technical movement from here to there, in order to ensure the meeting or the success of a certain goal, there has to be a temporally demarcated block of time within which only a certain allotted kind or amount of activity is permitted in order for a particular goal to be met before a certain deadline. That's all within the realm of the survival mechanism. And so operating, one deliberately blocks out perception of the infinite, the eternal, that is, that which has no limit. Survival, obviously, then dealing with the demarcation of time and space and ability and technicality, is a factor of limitation. So, the upper centers, one cannot perceive what they are, actually, unless one is willing to drop the limitation, which are necessities. The limitation itself is a necessity of the lower center. But in order to come up and begin working from this place, which makes one human, because every creature that is embodied is operating from here. The human being has the capacity to open this up and then activate these higher centers, which are an absolute natural part of our being, and then to perceive that which is beyond the limitation created by the necessity of, or rather invented, I should say, by the necessity of engaging in the survival process. So, to step into the heart center, one must be willing to let go of the limiting factors which are necessary for the sake of ensuring survival, but which actually, beyond a certain point, no longer aid and assist in survival, but rather in our own self-destruction. And we've reached that point, collectively, totally, as a human species upon this planet. So now the only way forward is to be willing to dissolve the limitations, the barriers, the boundaries, the borders, inwardly invented, inwardly artificed, in order to ensure a kind of survival, which one point in time served for the perpetuation of the tribe, the tribal unit, and all of its increasingly, incrementally wider spheres, but which ultimately cannot become that one sphere which encompasses everything, because the nature of this ever incrementally increasing sphere of belonging is not capable of holding everything. It's only capable of existing in division against some other, whether that other is nature, whether that other is the people next door, or the tribe across the river, or the next state over, or the next country over, or the other gender, or the other whatever. The other religious, it's all the same thing. The other. When this opens up, there's clear perception that there's no other. It's very clearly seen that we're on one planet with one system of life. You see that the rivers are the veins, all feeding into the same oceans. The weather pattern upon this planet is one giant system. The migratory patterns of all the birds and all the animals and the insects are all feeding into one ecology. And what human beings do in one country affects human beings all the way around the world. And not just in terms of the socio-political system, because even our economy is global. There's no way for it not to be. But every single ecosystem upon this planet has global consequences and global effects, however localized it might seem to be. And so, when the heart center is allowed to open, one sees clearly that everything affects everything else. Everything touches everything else. And there must be a willingness to perceive this. There must be a willingness for the heart center to open up. And the open heart is the true place of the depth of realization. The heart, the true heart, is the soul itself. And when the voice speaks from that place, it resonates. It magnetizes. And it demands to be heard, not through yelling and screaming, but the very force of its magnetic draw, of its magnetic quality, causes those who hear it to stop and listen, because there's a deep resonance that comes forth through that voice. And one sees clearly that reality, in a very true sense, is voice controlled, is voice activated. And as human beings, we have a responsibility to, as I'll call it, to speak light. That is, to speak in an illuminating way, to show what is. Now, earlier, I began discussing darkness, and then we continued on discussing the nature of the various centers in the body, which we have not come to the end of yet. But there's a difference between the darkness of artifice, which is the darkness of the invention of the lower self, which is the ignorance of violence, of greed, of envy, of wrath, and all of that trauma. And then and you could call that, I call it false darkness, or lowercase d darkness, and because we've used that word quite frequently to basically mean what we have called evil, and everybody will have their understanding of that, their idea of that. But then there is the capital D darkness, which is simply the darkness of night. Pure, innocent. There's nothing nefarious about that. And there's the capital L light, which is simply the light of the sun, the light of the day. The light that is the substance of everything physical. And that capital D darkness is that space, is that void in which the light appears. It's not evil, it's not wicked. What is meant really by the darkness that is meant to mean, or that is used synonymously with the words evil or wicked, that is all created by human beings. That's created by thought. I'm not interested, forgive me, for those who come from different metaphysical backgrounds, shamanic or otherwise. I'm not interested in going into expositions of literalism regarding the narrative forms of the modalities of creation or the timescape of creation handed down to us, as I quite commonly encounter people who take these narratives literally, not seeing their multidimensional nature, and using narratives that we've been handed, such as wars between entities of so-called light and entities of so-called darkness that existed before human beings, and blaming that or pointing to that as the actual source of evil, or what we would call wickedness, or etc., etc. Those narratives, taken literally in that way, are ways of denying, ignoring the human responsibility in the generation of violence. Every human being has a choice, and this is seen clearly when we come into awareness of consciousness, of who and what we really are. So, I advise you wholeheartedly and completely against ascribing what you would call violence or trauma or wickedness or evil to some external factor. that is, I must say, adolescent. It's fearful, it's fear-based, and it's a way of avoiding taking responsibility. If you look carefully at your own system, the way that your own system is built, you see clearly the whole order and mode of creation. The human being is the book of creation. The human being is the book, is the living book. And so all true mythologies, a true mythology is not something that somebody made up because it sounds nice, because it's what they wanted it to be. A true mythology is a story, is a narrative form which explains, which expounds in a dialectical or a narrative way the very scientific structure of the order of creation. And the human being is a living exemplar of that. The human being is the living book. So if you're willing to look at yourself as you are, without any filter, without any fear, and there can be no fear, otherwise you can't look, and therefore that means the willingness to transgress, which means to go beyond the cultural mode of interpretation, the commonly accepted cultural or traditional mode of interpretation of the stories, the myths, the narratives, which over time become more and more literally interpreted by the mass of the cultural milieu, and that over-literalization disallows one from perceiving what the stories are actually revealing because they're multidimensional, not monodimensional. When you make it literal, you make it monodimensional. And of course, the lower self, the ego, is monodimensional. But it's not multidimensional. But the true self is multidimensional. And therefore, the mythologies, as we call them, are really the highest technology of thought. Mythology and poetry are the highest technologies of thought because it's the only way that thought, that is, well, thought, the structures of thought itself, that which appears in the mind as pattern, as form, which can be passed down via words and concepts and symbols, this is the highest form of the use of thought because it is multidimensional, and therefore everything in a symbolic, mythological, narrative or dialectic structure is there pointing to many, many things at once. And it takes a willingness to be wrong, it takes a willingness to feel totally foolish, a willingness to feel like a complete and utter idiot, the willingness to feel absolutely ignorant, to surrender to the fact of your own ignorance, in order to perceive that which is beyond the conditioning and conditional construct of psychological imitation, which is our